They called it a Tommy cooker, a Ronson Lighter, a death trap on treads. It was slow, undergunned, and they said the Germans could wipe it out with just a single shot. A terrible tank in every sense of the word, but it stood its ground, never faltered, and ultimately won the war. But how did the M4 Sherman prove quantity beats quality, wiping the floor with everything the Germans threw its way? And how did they transform it from a conventional tank into a flamethrower? It's Normandy, 1944. On the one side of the battlefield, a Tiger I tank, the apex predator ready to hunt and destroy. On the other side, a column of Shermans, ready to roll out, but purely outmatched and outclassed. The Tiger fires. In seconds, a fireball erupts, and the Sherman is down. For the GIs inside, it was pure horror. Yet on the other side of the battlefield, the Germans were elated. They had won, and the best of US armor was destroyed. Then two more Shermans rock up from different sides. They have the Tiger surrounded. This isn't a one-on-one duel, it's a war, and the Allies understood something the Germans never could. The war wasn't going to be won by a few super tanks. It would be won by overwhelming numbers. The Shermans fire one after the other, with shells bouncing off the Tiger until one takes it off its track. Now it's a battle for survival, but far in the distance, even more Sherman tanks are lurking, waiting for their opportunity. It is exactly how the infamous Ronson Lighter became a symbol of dominance, not by power, but by sheer quantity, proving that perhaps numbers matter in the landscape of war. When the Americans entered the war, tank building was not one of their strong suits. They still relied on the M1, which was more of a combat car, and the M2, a light tank that was severely outdated. So the Americans came up with what can only be described as a stopgap, the M3 Lee, but this only had a 37mm gun, with a static 75mm field gun, but significantly lacked the technology to mount the 75mm to a rotating turret. Yet the United States came up with a plan, modifying the 75mm gun and cramming it into a hole in the fixed casemate. On top of that, the 37mm was also installed, and with a crew of 6 operators, they were sent into battle. Meanwhile, American engineers were working overtime, studying the European tanks while figuring out how they could build something even better. It had to be quick, agile, easy to produce, and most importantly, cheap. After some trial and error, the M4 Sherman was born. It ticked every box, and by October 1942, it was ready for battle. It was immediately thrust into battle under the British 8th Army at the Battle of El Alamein, where it was an immediate improvement over the Crusaders and M3 Lee. Yet, it wasn't invincible. Its main advantage was something that not even the Allies could manage to build, and the opposite of the German tank philosophy. On the other side of the battlefield, the Germans had designed some incredible tanks. The Panzer III and IV were already dominating, and when the Tiger I arrived, it was even more unstoppable. But this philosophy of going heavy, bulky, and powerful was one that would prove its biggest weakness. One of the key differences brought to the forefront by the Sherman was its ability to traverse any terrain. It was highly effective in the desert, and even transporting it was easy due to its lightweight size. One thing American engineers got right was using their expertise from the automotive industry, where they'd use only standardized parts that were easy to find. This meant that even if a Sherman was damaged, it could quickly be patched up and thrust back onto the battlefield. But when they came face to face with the Tiger I for the first time in Tunisia, it didn't end well. In fact, it was so bad that stories were passed on to new crews of the impressive Tiger and how it could light up a Sherman from over a mile with just a single shell. Yet the Americans pushed through, and the Sherman was set into production. The United States began pumping out these units at an astonishing pace, with about one tank rolling off the production line every 30 minutes. This meant that more than 50,000 of these tanks would make it to the front lines by the end of the war.
And overnight, the automobile industry of America transformed its plants, reshaped its tools, to become the greatest tank arsenal the world has ever known.
The Allies didn't care. They could now mass-produce tanks that were easy to use, cheap to maintain, and could outdrive anything the Germans had. To put it in perspective, the Sherman needed 1 hour of maintenance for every 6 hours of operation. Meanwhile, the Tiger required 1 hour of service for every hour of operation. And finding replacement parts for it proved nearly impossible as the war ended. But it wasn't just the production speed that made the Sherman a valuable World War II asset. It gave the Allies a different approach that stunned the Germans. Aside from the armament and the ease of repairs, the Sherman changed the battlefield tactics used by the Allies. They understood that facing off against a Tiger or Panther one-on-one would be absolutely impossible, and it was never intended to be a full-blown tank killer. When one private asked whether they should run when facing the powerful German armor, his sergeant responded by saying, "No, kid, you don't run. You call in your buddies. You use what you got. You hit 'em in the flanks. You get 'em from behind. You use our speed. You use our numbers. You swarm 'em like a pack of angry hornets. One of you might get knocked out, but 5 of you are gonna get through, and that's all that matters." It was a new doctrine. Not a battle of technological supremacy, but a battle of tactical ingenuity. And even more, the Allies could send them to the battlefield at a rate that was unheard of. For every Tiger or Panther the Germans sent to the front lines, they were met with at least 6 Shermans, which pounced like a bunch of wild dogs once they smelled blood. More impressive was the rate at which the Sherman could fire projectiles, often firing 20 rounds per minute due to its lighter shells that were a lot easier to reload. Adding to this was the variation of smoke shells, which blinded the slower German armor, even destroying their advanced optics. Once the smoke cleared, an enemy tank could be staring down the barrel of 8 Shermans, unleashing like a firing squad at a single target. But even then, it became clear that choosing your battles was only a luxury crews had when training. When facing 3 Panzers IV, 2 Tigers, and 1 Panther, the number of Shermans would be outclassed every single day, so the Americans turned to their British allies for a much-needed upgrade. Much like the Americans had done with the M3 Lee, the British mounted a 17-pound gun on the Sherman's turret, which turned into the Firefly version. This was later improved upon by the United States when they developed the 76mm gun, mounted to a new turret for versions like the EZ-8 variation. This later fixed the armor problem and gave the tank a bit more punch to smash through various lines of German defense. Yet the casualties on the American side were still staggering, leading to many people calling it a Tommy Cooker, literally cooking its crew alive inside. One of the main weaknesses faced by Sherman crews was lack of powerful armor. It meant that just one hit from a Tiger would cause it to either explode or catch on fire. It gave the Germans more confidence, knowing that they could easily destroy these tanks, especially with the help of the Flak 88. In fact, a single hit by a Flak 88 would certainly destroy the Sherman, or at least put it out of action. But when the numbers were calculated by the end of the war, it wasn't nearly as dangerous as German armor. To put it into perspective, only 1.3 crew members would lose their lives for every single tank that was destroyed, which was less than half that of the T-34 crews on the Soviet side of the battlefield. This was despite the Sherman having more crew members. So, what was the actual weakness of the Sherman then? Well, much like the German Panther, shells were often stored in the sides or the Sponsorn in unarmored containers. What the Americans forgot was that of all tanks in the war, this was the most likely spot to be targeted and hit. It meant that the shells were exposed to sparks and shrapnel that would fly through the tank when it was penetrated. At least 7 out of every 10 Shermans would burst into flames when it was hit on the sides, and the United States came up with a solution, moving the ammo rack to the floor with wet stowage being introduced. It immediately reduced the risk of bursting into flames by a whopping 50%. The survivability of crews increased significantly, and the Sherman could run riot on the battlefield. By the end of the war, more than half of all Shermans were either destroyed or taken off the battlefield due to severe damage. This still left a whopping 24,000 that were operational. In comparison, the German Tiger I, Tiger II, and Panther tanks only had about 8,000 units combined, which meant that they were always outnumbered, regardless of their power and quality. As one German soldier remarked, "One of our Tiger tanks is worth 10 Shermans, but the Americans always bring 11. And this would be the central theme of the successes achieved by the Sherman by the end of the war. By the time the United States invaded places like Okinawa and Iwo Jima, the Sherman once again changed, but this time it was even more deadly. Since flamethrowers were at a premium and only had a few days to live on the battlefield, the M4 was changed into a flamethrower. It significantly changed the battlefield, disrupting Japanese strongholds and creating a deadly force that ultimately contributed to the Allied victory. But speaking of flamethrowers, many of these men risked their lives, often only having a few minutes to live, until one man became a hero for his skills in handling his weapon. Check out this video to find out exactly how